Redgate!
Thank you, Benny, and thank you everyone for joining me here tonight in New Zealand time for a modern data warehouse journey from on-premise to cloud. My name is Gerald Hartley, and here's a little rundown of what to expect in the session. Now, it's very much a 100 level session, so friendly to beginners, intermediates, professionals, or just anyone involved in tech in some way or form. I'm going to assume that's most of us here. Otherwise, you might be in the wrong virtual meeting room. You're more welcome to stay, but kudos to you if you make it to the end. Now, this is not a deep dive or a demo focus. It's mainly me talking about my experiences and my challenges from moving from an on-premise environment to a cloud-based environment, and hopefully encourage everyone to share some of their experiences, their ideas and discussions as well. Now, a bit of a roadmap for this meeting. My experience has mainly been in the Microsoft Business Intelligence platform, but the stories and concepts could easily be applied to any other cloud services platform, whether it be Azure, Amazon, Google Cloud Platform, or Snowflake. And the agenda for today, I'll give you a little bit of background about why it is that cloud technology has been the biggest shift in the industry in the last few years. And from a personal viewpoint, why I was so intrigued with it. A journey of 1,000 miles, how to get buy-in, how to get started working with the tools, and what to do if you struggle to get either of these over the line at your workplace. And now that I'm working with the tool sets, let's compare the different approaches between on-premises and cloud-based technologies and start to break down the things that are great or perhaps not so great or challenging. And a little bit about me. Before we get started on the modern data warehouse journey, let me tell you a bit about my own journey so far. Now, I'm born, bred and based in the city of Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm currently working for Meridian Energy, which is one of New Zealand's largest companies in the energy sector. Now, it's been about 9 years working in the data space, primarily with Microsoft Business Intelligence solutions. And for the majority of these 9 years, I haven't had the opportunity to work with cloud-based technology, but that wasn't until recently. Now, like I said, I'm based in my hometown of Christchurch, New Zealand. Now, you could be forgiven for not knowing where New Zealand is, because it's kind of a running joke that New Zealand is routinely missing from maps, and it should be approximately around there. Given the current climate of things, it may not necessarily be a bad thing. But for me, shortly after graduating from university almost 10 years ago to the day, my hometown of Christchurch made headlines around the world for all the wrong reasons. Because tragedy struck when Christchurch experienced one of the worst disasters that it has ever faced in recent years. A magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck the city, destroying homes, disrupting businesses, and impacting the lives of thousands of New Zealanders in the process. Yeah, indeed, times were tough. Jobs and careers had to be put on hold while we had to deal with the issues immediately in front of us. But whether it's a tragedy like this on a local scale or even a global disaster like the likes of the one we're currently facing, there's only one way to move, and that's forward. So after some time, Christchurch would rise from the ashes and rebuild from this disaster. One industry in particular that was experiencing a huge surge of incoming work was the construction industry. And for me, opportunity struck when one such company was looking for an eager, confident, fresh-faced up-and-comer to help deal with the increasing workload and calls that their support desk was receiving. But instead, they chose this guy. Not quite exactly, that was my high school years, and I wish I could grow hair like that again. No, instead, they went with this fellow. Now, this picture was literally taken on day one, and look at that face, so young, so chubby, so innocent, so naive. If only he knew what he was going to be in for. But it was with civil infrastructure company CityCare Limited where I would get my start as a desktop and development support technician. that sounds to you like two jobs conveniently wrapped up into one, you'd be about right, and it probably worked as well as you could imagine. But it was a great opportunity because I managed to gain some solid grounding in both technical and developmental support. And once I found my feet, I began to shift into a full-time development support role, working alongside an amazing team of talented and knowledgeable developers. Now, at this point in my career, I dabbled in Oracle. I played around with SQL Server during my studies at university, but let's face it, I knew nothing. So it was in the first 3 to 4 years of my career that I'd go from knowing absolutely very little about SQL Server to knowing absolutely everything there is to know in such a short space of time. And courtesy to something they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, quickly realizing that there's a lot more to this than I thought. But it was an awesome opportunity, again, to get so much experience in many different areas: troubleshooting queries, optimizing performance, reporting, migrations, analytics, architecture. I didn't know it at the time, but this experience would be career defining because it would be the first time that I would be involved in an area that I'd never stumbled across in my line of studies. That was data warehousing. Although these were early days in my career, there were discussions going on about a certain thing called cloud technology. There was basically Amazon started releasing its services back in 2000, as early as 2005. Now, these were early stages of my career. I probably wouldn't be facing these kinds of decisions till much, much later down the track, and I couldn't get a grasp on what the benefits actually were with having cloud-based technologies. But there were discussions going on at the time, because consider the situation that we were facing in New Zealand. It's been 1 year since one of New Zealand's greatest natural disasters. So disaster recovery was certainly a hot topic at the time. Servers and hardware were in need of replacing. Some locally hosted servers and equipment were damaged, while patches and updates were well overdue for some of our most critical systems. Now, the purchase costs of new or replacement hardware were starting to mount up with the increased demand. Supply chain disruptions meant that orders and deliveries had much longer waiting times than originally anticipated. Now, staff and team members were displaced and needed concurrent access to some of the most critical resources and development environments from anywhere, as it probably wasn't always possible for the staff to make it in the office. And all the while ensuring our core systems were resilient, they were responsive, and they were able to keep up with the demands, juggling business as usual activities with the ever amount of increasing reactive work as well. Now, of course, this was all the way back as early as 2012, and these were early days as far as cloud was concerned. Bandwidth limitations meant network performance was a critical issue for some companies, while poor coverage meant network connectivity and availability just wasn't as reliable as it is now. Now, although security and protection measures were in place at the time, data was being sent and hosted externally. If you're handling data from customers or external businesses, then security and privacy were huge risk factors for an organization. Ensure pricing plans weren't as fleshed out, they weren't as transparent, and it made things like costs difficult to estimate. And indeed, there wasn't a great range of experts in the industry who had reliable hands-on experience with cloud technologies. Now, migration paths and options weren't as clear nor as flexible. So in some cases, a lift and shift from the whole environment was interpreted to be the only migration approach. So while the idea was nice and the benefits were clear, the risk was just far too high to become an early adopter of cloud offerings. And fair enough. Back then, a lot of these were valid concerns given the limitations that we had at the time. And so the stability, that familiarity we had with on-premise technology just straight out made it the clear winner for now. So as I developed my career and would grow over the years, I'd get the chance to work alongside medium to large size companies in the construction, insurance, and energy industries, helping them build, develop, and maintain their data warehouse solutions. Now, this diagram represents a basic example of the kind of architecture and tool sets that I'd be dealing with. I'd be primarily developing these solutions using Microsoft's business intelligence tools such as SQL Server databases, integration services, reporting and analysis services, and Power BI. Now, the majority of my time would be spent working with on-premise production environments and technologies, databases and services being hosted either self-hosted or hosted on managed servers with our local vendors. Now, at this stage of my career, I didn't have much of a say about how the architecture was implemented. I was simply working with what was already there. But as I gained skills and experience and started asking a whole bunch of questions along the way, I developed an understanding and sense of the decision process that went into developing the architecture and learning about the numerous factors, the variables, and the limitations that we needed to consider at the time. Now, the skills I'd gained from this experience would prove to be incredibly useful throughout my career, especially when it comes to planning out a cloud migration, and I'll be sure to touch on that a bit later. But it was around 2015 when business was starting to really pick up and cloud technology started gaining traction. Now, providers were throwing piles of cash to expand their range of infrastructure, platforms, software as a service offerings just to keep up with the market leaders at the time. Now, the offerings were becoming flexible enough so that both major companies and young startups could pick and choose the parts they wanted to take to cloud. The microservices architecture really started coming into its own here as cloud tech provided the ability to scale both horizontally and vertically with just a click of a button. Now, this gave massive competitive advantage to companies who could leverage these scalable, these flexible, constantly up-to-date systems and quickly deploy these applications to market. Now, as you can imagine, all the articles filled with all the buzzwords you can imagine, they were coming out claiming technology was the biggest industry game changer. It was the biggest paradigm shift that the industry had ever seen. It was a career ender for data developers. It was career ender for data developers. I know what you're thinking. This sounds like a silly concept in retrospect, but this was the first real threat to my job. I just found my job. I kind of liked having my job, and I'd rather like to keep it if I could. Now, if this was the direction that the industry was going to go in, if this is the kind of technology I'd be working with in the future, and if there were opportunities indeed coming up in this space, I'd best keep up with the crowd and try and stay as relevant as possible, because it is the nature of the fast-paced industry that we're in. But as the years went on, we saw more and more of these articles that were simply gushing about the prospect of cloud services, with plenty more dismissing it as simply a fad. But the benefits it provided were certainly enticing and would become even more so as technology improved. Now, internet speeds were becoming faster, connections were becoming more reliable, and cloud services were starting to guarantee uptime as part of their service level agreements. Security indeed was still a concern given how many hacks and breaches that major companies had experienced over the years. But security started becoming a focal point across all cloud systems as vendors aimed to provide the highest level of security and access measures as possible, providing services that came with data encryption, authentication controls, authorization standards right out of the box. And as cloud service started gaining traction, pricing plans started to become transparent and predictable. Reduced upkeep of servers in-house and expensive contracts with external vendors meant that in some cases there were savings to be had. And while hardware to an extent was actually becoming cheaper and faster with a high capacity, The actual running costs and work hours involved with maintaining and improving this equipment were piling up. Now, for those of you that were working with smaller companies, or if you've been around a single company for long enough, you'll sometimes find yourself playing double duties in some roles. One day you'll be wearing your BI hat, other days you'll be wearing your DBA hat, other days sys engineer, and so forth. And although you know how to do these tasks, all that content shifting slowly starts chipping away at your time, your capacity, your productivity, taking you away from your core duties to do the things that you actually signed up to do. Now, those risk factors, those list of excuses for not moving to cloud, well, technology had caught up and that list was certainly shrinking. And it was evident that larger companies were already putting their cloud migration strategies into place, while up and coming startups were starting to adopt cloud-first approaches. It wasn't just becoming the feasible option, it was becoming the standard option for any new development. So with a few years of experience under my belt, I'd observed the trends and patterns in the industry. I'd subscribe to blogs, newsletters detailing the latest and greatest in cloud and data technologies. Now completed courses and tutorials, attended conferences and meetups such as this one. I took part in events and hackathons and spent up my developer benefits month after month. Sometimes that was intentional, other times I just forgot to switch off the VM. But even with all the training in the world, it wouldn't amount to much unless you were working with the tools in the wild, right? It's great to read what's on the packet, but it tends to be a whole different experience actually using the thing in production. So by about 2017 or 2018, there were a few more companies in my area who started dipping their toe into the water with cloud technology, but just not in a huge capacity. Now, of course, I couldn't just sit by and watch the rest of the industry outpace me. I needed to get in there and see things for myself. Now, sometimes this means going through the same rigor and the same process of pitching any kind of new software into the company, which, let's just say, may not be the most fun activity to do in the world as a developer. But from my experience, I found getting buy-in from fellow colleagues and workmates a relatively easy job. They could easily grasp the benefits of cloud-based technology and would mostly share the same concerns about falling behind as I did. But now you'll need to influence the people who can influence change further up the chain, the ones who have the power to actually make it happen. Now, it's likely that they're the ones who aren't as hands-on with the tools as the devs are, and there's a very high chance that you need to come armed with facts, figures, a prototype of sorts before they approve any spend. Now, things might be a bit easier if you already have certain operations in the cloud. Either yourself or another team within the business may be already using these services, so long as they're not using the services in anger or they don't already have a bad reputation. Maybe getting buy-in might not be as challenging as it would be starting from scratch. And it is 2021, so to an extent, people are likely familiar with the concept and won't take long to get caught up to speed. Now, if you don't already have tech in the cloud, then try starting small. Find a smaller module, relatively low risk, low impact, and ensure that it takes advantage of the benefits that I listed earlier. So for example, if you had a basic module in an application, then that would save resources on an existing server, then this might be a fantastic first candidate. Now monitor this module and start collecting metrics as the average, such as the average throughput, the amount of resources it consumes, the number of staff hours it takes to keep this module running. Plug these figures into one of the many cloud pricing calculators provided from all major cloud vendors just to get an idea of the running costs involved with the cloud-based environment. And here are a few items to consider when pitching cloud technologies. Cost, money's the universal language. Cost is one of the biggest factors for moving to a cloud-based solution. because rather than buying all that kit, all the licenses, and dealing with the maintenance costs such as time and money, with cloud solutions, you can opt for a pay-as-you-go approach where your costs can vary based on consumption, compute time, level of performance for these resources. And as I mentioned earlier, pricing calculators are available to get cost estimates based on current application workloads. And if you're confident that traffic volumes and data size are consistent and predictable, then maybe you'll be able to make savings by purchasing reserved instances, which allow you to prepay for compute upfront in exchange for a discounted rate. Just freshen up there for a second. Time and resources. They may say that time is money, but once it's gone, it's something we don't get back. Now, if we're saving large amounts of time by relieving ourselves from admin tasks that take developers away from their core focus, we're not only saving time, but with all that context switching and going back and forth, we gain a lot back in terms of productivity. And as for performance, this ties nicely with performance, because if you've bought an expensive piece of equipment that 80% of the time gets used less than maybe 20% of its resources, it's probably a good chance you overspent there. No, or in other words, you bought a Ferrari, but you're driving it like a Toyota. The benefit of cloud services, that means you can seamlessly increase or decrease performance on demand. So if you do end up finding a spike in the workload, it only takes a couple of config changes to bump it up to a higher compute speed for a while, then bring it back down once it settles. And in terms of feature sets, I'm sure that devs and business users alike are sick and tired of being told no, simply because the current version doesn't support the feature they want. Now, for those working in cloud technologies at the moment, you'll notice how rapidly features are added, generally on a monthly cadence. Now, this does mean that you'll have to be vigilant on the features that get released, as some changes may impact your current environment. Now, a lot of these changes are usually for the better, except when they're not. But it's no different from any usual system upgrade, except all the work that goes into upgrading the applications themselves is already handled for you. And finally, the user base. As I said, major companies have decided to migrate their core systems into the cloud. Fresh startups are quicker to deploy to market without having to invest in resources on hand, and vendors themselves are investing pouring buckets of cash into the infrastructure. So with an estimated 80% of businesses expected to migrate to the cloud in 2025, why should we be the ones who are left out of there? If we're not keeping up, then it's likely that we're falling behind. Now, despite all the effort that you may have to go through, you just may find that the company aren't willing to risk the shift to their platform. Fair enough, it is their decision at the end of the day. But even worse, you may even get verbal agreement to proceed, only to find that it's constantly sidelined due to the next project of significance, or things just aren't happening at the pace that you'd hope they would happen. So the options here are either to wait it out and see what happens. It may just be around the corner, it may be a few years away from now, who knows? If these decisions are indeed outside your circle of influence, then that's what you may have to be facing. Now, do you have the patience to wait that long? It's probably up to you. But in some cases, there may be another team in your organization who are already using some sort of cloud tools. They might not be using a platform you're familiar with, but get into a conversation with them and ask them about their experience, and indeed ask about the benefits that they see. And if there's no luck in that department and you've exhausted all other options, the last step for you here, now for any managers in the room, you may want to cover your ears or take your headphones off for a bit. You may want to start looking for companies that are already using these tools. But no matter which option or which way you go, all of these options require a level of effort in different areas, whether it means having to negotiate up the chain, shifting teams internally, or having to go to job interviews and changing companies entirely. Now, maybe all of these options will be entirely infeasible for you, and that's fine. At the end of the day, it comes down to what your goals are, what you're willing to put up with, and what you want to achieve in your career. It's all completely up to you. And by all means, don't think that by not working on the cloud that you and your career are riding off into the sunset. Now, if you've been in the game for a while with years of experience working in on-premise environments, you'll probably still have enough work to last you to the end of your career, because there are still companies out there who are light years away from being ready to make the move. But if you are looking to start on something new, if you are looking to upskill in a new area or a different field, or you're just starting out in the data world, then by all means stick to the cloud data stack. Don't ask me about it. Just take a look at the jobs out there at the moment that are asking for experience with these cloud data tools. Highly valuable, highly sought after skills to have. And if you are wondering what option I did indeed take, option number 3 on that list. So at my previous job, we were in a constant state of being just one small step away from using the cloud data warehouse and analytics tools. We got the buy-in, we got the training, we scoped out the initial processes and the initial architecture, but it just seemed to be constantly bumped for the next highest priority, be it a system upgrade or be it a movement of another database server. So it was always just a little bit out of reach. Would it come eventually? Probably, but not at a speed that I was overly happy with. So it was in 2020 of all years when I noticed a job as a BI developer working with cloud technology. One of the requirements for the role was actually having experience with the Microsoft Azure data platform, of which I had little to probably none. Now, especially for those relatively early in their careers, you might mistake this as, oh, this was listed as a requirement. I don't meet the requirements. I'm probably going to have to sit this one out. But no, it was only one requirement out of several, and certainly not the deal breaker that it was made out to be. I won't talk about sifting through job descriptions because there's probably enough material there to cover a whole other presentation. But what I did have was several years of on-premise experience under my belt, a solid grasp of data warehouse concepts and models, fairly crisp looking resume, and some very supported references lined up. So a few takeaway messages from my experience. It's for the benefits and risks. Technology has gained a huge amount of traction over the years. Even though there were quite a few initial limitations in the early stages, it's definitely gained some maturity as a technology, and uptake has improved as well. Getting buy-in with the company, you may have to broaden your horizons and start working on those negotiation tools to make sure management are aware of the benefits that cloud provides. And FOMO, fear of missing out. Don't think that all those years in an on-premise environment will dampen your career progression in any form. Cloud tech is still relatively new in the scheme of things. So even though you're just starting out, a solid grounding in the fundamental and core underlying concepts will be more than enough to get your foot in the door, despite what these job descriptions can ask for. This leads us into expectations versus reality. And what a better way to illustrate this than with a meme while I take a strategically placed water break. Now, as far as this picture goes, I just say to my mum, I work in a call center because it's easier than trying to go there and explain what I actually do, which tends to confuse most people, but especially her. But at the tail end of last year, I felt reasonably confident going into my new role at Meridian. The interview process gave me a clear picture on what the objectives were and the kind of tasks that I'd need to complete in order to achieve them. Now, I felt I asked the right questions. I asked about the decisions involved with the concerns and the challenges of working on a cloud data platform. In this instance, I'd be working with Microsoft Azure. Now, the project they were working on was a fairly new greenfields data warehousing project that was going straight to cloud first, which was kind of great. I had no messy migrations to deal with. It was just straight into it. But the only part that did spark a bit of anxiety in me would be my familiarity with the tool sets. As I mentioned, I'd completed a few training courses, I'd done a few workshops, but was I going to take the typical 3 to 6 months before I was a productive staff member? I didn't really want that, and I kind of wanted to hit the ground running. So as I mentioned earlier, this diagram is an example of the architecture that I've dealt with through the majority of my career. Now, I typically find a operational data store, or ODS, which either consisted of a replicated copy or subset of the application database. Most sources that I've dealt with were either relational databases or API feeds, so sometimes there was a need for a cross-database replication or translation layer. ETL would be handled with SQL Server databases using views and stored procedures, or by using the workflow processes available in SQL Server integration service packages. Now, the packages themselves would be kept in a form of source control where, depending on the environment, were deployed to the data catalog using PowerShell scripts or copied directly to the server. And from there, orchestration and scheduling of these pipelines will be handled using SQL Server agent jobs, which would then schedule and run our packages and feed into a structured data warehouse hosted again on SQL Server. Now, data would be accessed using various tools such as Power BI, APIs, SQL Service Analysis Services, Tableau, Excel, flat file reporting. Basically, whatever was needed by the business, we could probably handle. Now, when it comes to shifting to cloud, there are some considerations to make, and I learned about an amazing concept called thinking flat, the flat model. So familiarity, how familiar are the staff, development team, leaders, end users, how familiar are they with the cloud-based tools? What is the experience level with the developers? Do they require training to get exposure to the platform? Do they have access to Azure free credits to start being able to develop proof of concepts in their business? Location, the storage, the region, where is the data and where does it need to be? Location will impact performance in some way and form, and in some cases choosing either the cheapest or even the closest option may not necessarily result in the best outcomes. Now, does it also adhere to compliance or regulation standards as well? As for architecture, previously you might have been limited by choice and resources with on-premise environments. New software requires upgrades, configuration, maintenance, licensing. Now with cloud, you can select from a huge range of tools available and deploy them with almost simply a click of the button. Now, with this many tools and options available, what tools might you choose? How do you go about identifying the best tool for the job? And what business needs do we need to incorporate when we're actually designing a solution architecture? And for translation, how easy is it to convert your existing on-premise solution to the cloud? Are there any major obstacles, key differences, limitations that mean maybe cloud isn't the best solution? What are your options when it comes to migrating your solution? Does it have to be lift and shift, take everything up and shift it up to the cloud, or can it be piecemeal? Can it be modularized? Can we take small sections at a time and have a hybrid-like environment? Now let's compare the previous architecture to the type of cloud-based architecture that I'd be using in my role, my new role. Now the tools may look a little bit different, sure, but the architectures seems rather familiar. The data warehouse itself is hosted on Azure SQL databases, while pipelines, orchestration, and scheduling, previously handled by SSIS, now handled by Azure Data Factory. Now, in the infrastructure I currently work with, we'd be calling APIs which output flat files. These would be ingested into our data warehousing environment. Now, although it's not probably not the most ideal in terms of implementation. The Azure Data Factory has a huge collection of connectors straight out of the box. So should the data feed change down the line, and we know it most certainly will, won't be a hard task to actually make the switch. Now, ETLs were designed in a similar fashion to our on-premises environment, but this time we would design our pipelines using a mix of copy and transform routines from Azure Data Factory and views and procedures stored in Azure SQL databases. Now, for our database models and ADF pipelines, they were kept in source control repositories using Azure DevOps repositories, which will also handle deployment and release processes to different environments as well. So scheduling was also configured inside Azure Data Factory, and pipelines were set to run at certain times of the day on certain days. Data would be accessed and presented using various feeds, which pulled from our cloud-based warehouse, again using industry standard tools, Power BI, APIs, SSIS, Tableau, Excel flat files, again, whatever the business required. Now, with the feature set so rich, you'd have to potentially sift through a myriad of potential solutions to develop an architecture that best suits the business needs. Now, similar to last time, I came into an environment where the solution was all up, it was all ready to go. But we do have to go through regular reviews, checks, and changes as we need. Now, as I mentioned, there are often many ways to achieve the same result. So I've also added an alternative architecture, which comprises of a slightly different tool set. Now, the benefits may vary depending on the products that you are using. Azure Data Lake Storage provides massively scalable, secure, cost-effective data lake storage for high-performance workloads, which tie nicely to both Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, which are both capable of processing data on a petabyte scale. And while Azure Analysis Services brings a traditional on-premise version of SQL Server analysis services to the cloud. But in our case, we found that these tools performed well and truly beyond the needs of our use cases at this time. And these products tend to be priced at a premium for such services. So looking back to the flat model, developers were already experienced and familiar with SQL Server databases. Geo-replication wasn't a requirement, and we were lucky to be even processing gigabytes, let alone petabytes of data. It made sense that we'd move to a model that closely resembled an on-premise environment, but still had enough flexibility to upgrade further down the line when the need arises. Now, before I continue, let me provide one big disclaimer. These are still very much early days for me, and I probably haven't used these tools long enough to actually hate them. But I'm slightly more familiar with the tool set now than when I started. So here's a few observations that I've made just by working with the tools for the last few months. Now, I love the fact that there's less noise to deal with. So far, my DBA hat, my sysadmin hat, they're sitting there collecting dust. I don't miss digging into database servers and trying to triage and find apps that have gone rogue and taken the database server hostage. Since we're using a platform as a service solution, then the environments themselves are focused on doing just one thing and doing it one thing well. Now, it doesn't mean that cloud services will automatically handle my poorly written SQL queries each time. Probably not, hopefully in the future. So for now, that's probably still on me. Now, ease of access with Azure Active Directory, I don't have to worry about getting locked out if I'm having issues connecting to the company's VPN. All I need is access to the internet and maybe my phone for third-party authentication, and away I go. That's it. In a pinch, I could even use my phone to start monitoring pipeline progress and track issues. And since all the heavy lifting itself is taking place on these servers in the cloud somewhere, I'm just using the interface as somewhat of a terminal for executing what I need and when I need it. I've really been enjoying the streamlined interface it provides compared to the workflow process that I'd have with on-premise tools. I felt the interface in especially Azure Data Factory to be more streamlined, because in most cases it takes a few clicks all in the same browser window to go from building to debugging Data Factory pipelines to publishing them, committing change scripts to source control, all the way through to release and deploy. Now for Azure Data Factory, I find it pairs nicely with Azure DevOps repositories, but there are connectors available for the likes of GitHub, SVN, flat file backups, and many others. Now, as far as the feature sets goes, new additions, no more waiting around for planned upgrades just to get the latest and the greatest features. You get to have the new features on the same day as everyone else. Cloud providers tend to release features in a public preview before they're made generally available, similar to a try before you buy sort of manner. Now, sometimes I've had to find ways to code around a certain limitation or a certain issue that I've been having with Data Factory configuration, but only to discover that a new change or a new fix had been recently released, which fully addresses a problem, which is a big win in my book. But for any architecture decision, there will be trade-offs, and for cloud, there's no exception. Because in exchange for that reduced effort when it comes to upkeep and maintenance, the flip side to this is that we may have to give up access to areas which we may have had previously. Now, the extent of this is going to vary between positions. So for those with properly implemented security standards with all the best practices in place, you might not even notice a thing. Those who had admin rights to absolutely everything, this might appear a little more obvious. And perhaps there were times where it was a fairly handy task to go in and troubleshoot at the server level, make changes there and quickly launch a hotfix if you needed to. But if you hear alarm bells ringing already, then you're well aware that this depends so much on the impact of the change in question, because one wrong move, one mishap in a production environment and things can all go horribly wrong. So considering the amount of close calls, the amount of rework, the amount of general wasted time because of such moves, this is probably a limitation that I am willing to put up with. Managing change, a regular release cadence means that we have to be adaptive to change. Now, this isn't unusual for us in the industry. We just need to be aware of the impact that changes and releases bring. Best practices, processes, documentation, that can all get quickly outdated if updates are not accounted for. Now, usually if there are changes to fix outstanding issues or improvements to existing tools, or in fact the changes are sought after requests from users. But when you have a system that has so many moving parts around the place, sometimes a small change in one area can have a snowball effect further downstream. And as for security, we hear about major data security breaches happening almost every day. Almost all cloud providers have made the headlines at one point in time for a major outage or a system disruption. Yes, it's still a concern. Your information is being transferred to the same place where mum rants on Facebook, where the kids watch their TikTok videos, and where Gerald watches old clips of his old all-time sporting hero, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Would I feel comfortable logging into a company's environment across a public Wi-Fi network? Probably not. And as far as network dependency, this one is also a bit of a stretch, because at least where I am, I'm fortunate enough to have access to a reliable internet connection at most times. It's all I really need to do my job. But I am aware that at certain locations, simply don't have that level of access to a stable, reliable, high bandwidth connection. You might find things that run faster on a locally hosted internal or private network. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all the hard work runs on servers hosted with cloud providers, data centers. So unless you're pulling gigabytes of data back and forth from the cloud server database from your local machine, your machine is mostly acting as a terminal, meaning connection stability will be important, but huge amounts of bandwidth available, probably not so much. Now, there are some considerations to be made when moving from on-premise to cloud, but overall, I thought the learning curve wasn't as bad as I thought. Now, if you've been working on on-premise environments for a long time, then these skills are most definitely transferable to a cloud-based environment. And I found pickup on this technology to be very quick. Within the span of a few months, I was able to be a productive staff member. Now, in my experience, I've found most things, thankfully, to be the same or at least very familiar to what I've been working with. And I think they were built with that in mind. Now, sure, there are a few concepts and ways of working that may take a little time to get used to. Coming from a SSIS background, it took some time to find my way and navigate around Azure data factories, change things from using the pipeline terminology to using database pipelines stored in JSON. So it did take some time to get used to it, but the pickup was fairly straightforward and fairly intuitive. And I found the skills that I've been able to get out of it were very much a worthwhile experience. So if you are wondering, was it all worth it? Was it all worth changing jobs to finally get my hands on these tool sets? Perhaps it's too early to answer that question. Perhaps there's a question for a future presentation. But for those who have indeed made the switch already, I would love to hear your thoughts and your experiences from actually making the switch as well. So what's next? Because cloud tech opens up a whole bunch of opportunities out there, which open up many more paths for you to choose from. Now, here's a giant list of features and services provided by Azure. I don't think I've got enough years left in me to complete them all, but here they are for you. Now, with a feature set this big, it's probably a good idea to have some goals in mind. Now, there is an insane amount of growth going on with vendors providing fully managed cloud data platforms, providing the likes of petabyte scale big data analytics, enterprise level data warehousing. So products from companies such as Snowflake, Amazon Redshift, Azure Synapse Analytics, Google BigQuery. I haven't had the chance to use all of them outside of maybe a sandbox environment myself, but I would jump at the chance to explore some of these feature sets in depth, and hopefully I get the chance to do that in the future. Here's another awesome diagram from what I found of what it apparently takes to be a data engineer in 2021. For me, it'll probably take the length of a degree to actually complete the list, but it just goes to show you the ever list of components that sit within a modern data engineering platform. Now, I love the fact that I can dust off some of my old coding skills and put them to use again. So finding cases where I get to develop data pipelines using Python, Scala, Java, or Go is a pretty exciting prospect for me. So I'm doing my bit to keep those skills sharp. And of course, exploring a bit more into the world of data architecture. Yes, I can see the stunned faces of the developers in the room thinking, oh my goodness, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to head into architecture? I just couldn't think of absolutely anything worse. I know, right? But all the options, with all the options available in the cloud, with all the moving parts involved, there were a number of aspects to consider. And they're particularly important when it comes to getting buy-in from the business, because we need to answer, what are we trying to achieve with our solution? Does it actually add value to an organization? Does it solve the business problem? And does the solution align with the goals of the business? Which cloud provider best provides the options that we're looking for, and who indeed does it in the most cost-effective manner? How secure are our data assets? Who is able to access them? And how is it that they will access them? And what process do we have to ensure the quality and the integrity of our data, what it will be used for, and does it comply with regulations? Now, coming to the tail end of our journey so far, so here's a few recommendations on the work that I've dealt with so far. Now, regardless of the trends or fads, you'll stick to the work that you enjoy the most. If you really enjoy technology to the extent that you're willing to invest your own time and research into it, then stick with it. Tools come and go, processes may evolve over time, but the core concepts probably end up lasting the span of your career, maybe even more. Getting buy-in from your business to invest some resources in a small project or proof of concept. Invest some time in training. Those with enterprise agreements may already have training or licensing benefits just sitting there, such as the monthly Azure credits, the courses, exam vouchers. So go ahead and make the most of those. And if you are learning something new, go straight in, cloud first. Check out some of the resources that I'll be providing in the following slides and as part of the slide deck, such as the Microsoft Learn resources, Pluralsight, SQL Data Workshops. They're all fantastic resources, which I have personally used to actually have a play and come to grasps with the technology. Ask the provider what they can help provide with, what they can help provide, because they want your business too. They'll be happy to provide something for free so long as you're actually using it. And so follow the posts and videos from well-known figures in the SQL community, many of us joining us in this room tonight on social media such as Twitter, Slack, local meetup groups, New Stars of Data. And tech networking, talk to those that are currently using the technology, because not only is this a great opportunity to make new connections, but you also get to discover new ideas of what people are working on, how they're using the tools, why they went the direction they did, and get a perspective outside of your own. Now, there's probably an undersupply of talent in this area. So you're going to probably find people that are currently working with cloud technology to be more than happy to share their knowledge and experience to help build and grow new people in this area. And non-tech, as far as non-tech networking goes, don't forget about non-tech networking groups. For example, there's groups dedicated to soft skills such as presentation, business skills, communication, leadership. These skills not only help with your business and career prospects, but you may find areas within that group where those with tech skills are in fact in the minority. Now is your opportunity to show what you're able to work with and perhaps discover new opportunities or new projects to work on using these cloud-based solutions. And this leads nicely into the final point. Find a small project to work on. If you have a project that is relevant, that's relatable, that means something to you, be it a hobby or a club that you belong to, then you may start coming up with new ideas. Start ingesting your fitness activity onto your smartwatch. Build a pipeline to track the win-loss record of your local sports club. We collect data in some form every day, so you'll probably never run out of things to track. Pick the thing you like, the thing you can stick to, and stick to it. Again, here's a list of the resources that I'll provide in the slides. But just a final point, I do have some non-technical goals in mind, such as me deciding to do this presentation this evening, my time. Now, the presentations, I've been working on the presentation skills for quite a while, all the time leading up to this. So I would have never thought that 5 years ago that an introvert developer like myself would be here doing a presentation. Now, today's topic was very much a 100 level storytelling session, but I've got a whole list of ideas that I hope to cover in more detail shortly. And finally, giving back, if it's worth it to give back to the community that helped me keep a job for so long. I don't know whether it be altruism or insanity, but I'm excited about the prospect of contributing more presentations, more blog posts, more video content to the community going forward. So if you ever thought of sharing your story and sharing your story as well, I encourage you to do the same. And so finally tonight, I'd really love to give thanks to my mentor who's helped me along this data journey, Dustin Dorsey. With your help has been invaluable. Your advice has been amazing, and I appreciate all the talks we've had, all the lead ups to the session. It's been very much worthwhile. It's been a learning process for me, and definitely I'm sure we'll keep in touch and talk more. But thank you again for your assistance through this journey as well.
Yeah!